Good afternoon, everyone, and evening for some of you. If you can hear me fine, just let me know. Just do a quick mic check to make sure I'm coming through clearly. Hi, Brenda. Welcome. How's everyone doing today? I know this week was quite intense. And so before we jump in, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I don't know if any of you tuned in this morning, but so this might be repeat if you were watching this morning as well. Oh, good, good. I'm glad I'm coming through. Hi, Rosalie. Welcome. Okay, so I just wanted to first start off by saying that everyone did a really good job. So with the morning class and with this afternoon group, a lot of people sent in their homework with a lot of disclaimers about, their painting wasn't finished, apologizing or saying that, they were really embarrassed by their painting or they, had a hard time with it. And I just wanted to say that the purpose of these paintings is a color study. So I don't by any means expect a finished masterpiece. I realize it is a very tight timeline. It's a lot of work to do in each week. So I want you guys to think of these more as not a finished painting, but more a color study. There will be an opportunity towards the end of the class and so I want you guys to just, take it a little easier on yourself. Don't feel bad if you can't get it all painted in or if, you feel like it's not your best work. Because the key here is that we're learning and we're focused on color mixing. And that's mostly what I'll be covering here, is talking about the colors that were mixed and used in the portrait. And I'm not going to be doing drawing corrections and all of that sort of thing. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Even for me doing the demonstrations and trying to keep the time a little bit shorter so that you guys don't have so much video to watch. Natalie, let me take a look real quick. Which email did you send it to? Let me see. But so the point is, guys, just remember to not be so hard on yourself, because everyone was like sending in their work saying, oh, this is awful, this is not my best work, don't even bother critiquing it. And I don't want you guys to feel that way. I really want you to just think of it as a learning experience, okay? Natalie, let me take a look and see. I didn't receive anything in, let's see. Oh, wait, I think I see, oh, that's what happened. My mistake. Natalie, I'm going to just switch your name here. This is your portrait. And I accidentally put it under Kaylee's, which she didn't submit anything, so I just switched those. So I'm going to change this to you. And then I'm going to change this to Kaylee. Okay, so there we go. Yours is in here. I did receive it. Sorry for the confusion. That was my mistake. I was still importing those very late last night. So, okay. Rosalie, you had mentioned something. Let me catch up here. Oh, okay. So you said found mixing the paint before you got the drawing done added to it becoming sticky. Yeah, it depends on if you are going to be painting the same day as you do the color mixing or if you're going to be spending a few different days doing that. You can do the color mixing after you do the drawing. That's perfectly fine. So I just layered the videos in that way because that's the order in which I did it. And some of the colors. If you're having an issue with that, I did put up a video on how to save your color. So some days when it was filming, I only had time to film the color mixing portion, and then I did the painting the next day. And so when I did that, I put all of my colors on a glass palette in my freezer, and that will keep them from getting sticky overnight. So, so if you need to kind of space out your days, try doing that, Rosalie, and you might find it helps. All right, so before we jump in with Aaron's painting here, which he had some questions, and that's why you see some text there. So I think those questions will benefit everyone. So I'll answer those. But before we do that, I want to talk really quickly about next week. So your new lesson is up today on medium flesh tones. But next weekend, I have an event on Saturday. So we have our critique on Sunday. So you guys are going to have an extra day to work, which I'm sure nobody has anything to complain about for that. So you can send in your work on Saturday next weekend. Okay? And then after that, we'll resume back to the Saturday session. So next weekend is the only exception to that. And it'll be the same time, 2:30 for our group. Okay? Pacific time, of course. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about before we jump in. And it's talking about our final project. So our final project, which will be weeks 5 and 6, we're going to be going into more creative color. Okay, so I will be providing new photo references of each of these models plus another model, a male model. And with those photographs, I used color gels and kind of fun experimental lighting. So you guys can choose one of those as your final project, which we'll work on over the course of 2 weeks. Or you guys are welcome to think about a painting you might want to do, a portrait that utilizes some interesting color. That's totally up to you. So if you guys wanted to paint someone you know, or you wanted to take some pictures, I just want to put that out there now so that you guys can start to think about that. It could be a self-portrait. It could be a portrait of someone you know. Some people like to just paint someone they know because it's a little bit easier. So keep that in mind. And if you do decide to do something from your own photo reference, you'll want to submit it to me to make sure that it's a good reference to work from. I'll kind of advise you on whether it'll work or not. What else? Oh, and that I'm going to send out the photo so you can take, for those of you who like to spend a little more time working on your drawing, you have a little bit more time over the next few weeks to do that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. But don't start the color stage until we talk about going into more extensive color. So that 2-week project is just for you guys to start to think about it and get ready. So this weekend, you got your lesson and we're doing medium flesh tones, and then next weekend you'll get your lesson on dark flesh tones, and then after that we will start talking about creative color. So does anyone have questions about that before we jump in? Life, because that happens. So just hang in there, take a break if you need it. I'll kind of go at a pretty steady pace. We're just going to be analyzing colors and talk about some mixture changes that you can make. The edits and suggestions I give you today on your paintings, you do not have to go in and correct them. I'm not expecting you to turn this in next week with the edits. This is just so that you can focus on, your improvement and take notes for if you ever decide to do another one of these paintings. On that note, you'll notice I provided 3 photo references of each model from different angles. You are welcome to choose any of those, and you're more than welcome to use those photo references in the future at any time for your own practice in the studio. So those are kind of given to you guys to utilize in your studio practice as a tool. Okay, so because I sometimes get questions about, copyright, like they want to send off their painting to a competition or a show and they ask me about copyright. If I provided it in the class, you guys are welcome to use it. Okay? All right, so Aaron, are you here? I know you said you might or might not be able to make it, But I wanted to start off with some of your questions before we get into your painting, because I thought your questions were relevant to everyone. And so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it. So your first question is about kind of the process of tiling. So is it best to try and complete these color studies in a single session? And you said you had blocked in the hair and the coarse shadows first, and then by the next day they had already dried. And then it was hard for you to kind of blend. So if I have a method for dealing with tiled layers that have already dried. And then a related question is, when I'm working on more finished paintings and I want to soften edges, does the tiling serve as an underpainting? So let's get to that second one here in just a minute. So the first question, ideally, it's best to do these in one sitting. However, it's a lot of work. I mean, I'm painting when I'm doing my demonstrations. I'm trying to move through them as quickly as I can. And I'm a much faster painter than I used to be. So I don't expect any of you to be able to do that in the same amount of time that I did. I tried to keep it as succinct as possible because watching someone paint can be rather boring. So I try to keep it to the point and a little bit quicker than I normally approach my personal work. So think of these as color studies, and you don't have to blend out the tiles for the color studies. If you want to leave them tiled and loose, that is perfectly fine. I blended the first demo because I wanted to show you guys how to do it. But in the second painting that you'll see today for your second lesson on medium flesh tones, you'll notice I left the painting a little bit looser, a little more brushwork. I went and softened a few edges, but I pretty much left it a little bit more on the loose side. And you guys are more than welcome to do that too. It doesn't need to look like a finished painting for our critiques. However, if you can't finish your painting in one sitting, because it is a lot of work, I recommend kind of blocking in large planes. So that would be kind of a method that you could break it up over 2 days. You could do hair and background one day, right? So do hair and background, that's day 1. Let me get a pen, it's a little easier. So you do those 2 on day 1, and then maybe do shadow and light planes in the kind of the cheek and forehead, and maybe stop at the nose and the lips and the eyes, and then in your final day do the lips, nose, and features. And it kind of helps because these are where plane changes tend to occur, so it's a little easier to transition. And my suggestion would be wherever you stop your paint, so if you stop your paint right here, just feather the edge with your brush so that you don't have a real thick paint ridge. And that's pretty much it. So there is that way of kind of breaking it up so that you can take your time and not feel like you have to do it all in one sitting. Another suggestion is to do the color mixing on one day and the painting on another. You know, that makes it a little bit easier and a little more manageable. And your related question on more finished paintings, yes, you do want to soften your forms, and it is kind of serving as an underpainting. I go into that in my color portraits course in really in depth. I mean, we do a classical method for that class, and so we start with an underpainting, a pretty detailed underpainting, and then move through each color stage, and it has maybe like 3 or 4 color layers. And so I talk about how to integrate those layers and how to move from and I still use tiling. So and it's still a challenge because that first day you want to be thought of the same way. This is like your color value map for, like, let's say you wanted to do this portrait again but on a larger scale and more finished. Well, then this study would be a great way for you to kind of dive right in and then determine how you want to approach maybe the more finished piece separately. So I hope that answered your question. And so let's go ahead and jump into some of the colors here. I'm just going to crop this image here. I'm not too worried about her shirt. I'm going to focus mostly on the face during our critique. And so if you were in, I don't see you in here live, but if you guys are attending this live and you see that your painting feels a little bit too bright, too washed out, then it feels in life to you, not compared to the photo, but in how your painting feels when you're sitting in front of it, let me know, because I can make some adjustments. I also make adjustments to color temperature. So if you are here, that does help. And I just wanted to let you know that. So, okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do essentially is take some color samples, and we're going to make some comparisons between the different areas, and I'm going to give you my suggestions for editing your colors. Again, you don't have to go in and fix your painting. This is more just for you to learn from, you know, what you've done and maybe what you could do differently in the future. And one thing I noticed very common in a lot of the paintings is that the shadow ended up too hot of a color. So it's a very saturated color, and compared to the color that we see here in the model. And so, and I noticed that my video camera had kind of picked up some of the red a little bit stronger than my painting feels. So I uploaded a photo, and I think I probably even warmed up her shadow maybe a little bit too much too. But I uploaded a high resolution picture of my demonstration. So you'll find it under the photo references group. So you guys can go in there and download that if you want to see my colors a little bit more close up. But so what I'm going to do is just take, you know, like an average of your shadow color. We're going to do a little sample here. And I'm going to take an approximate same area, and we're going to compare the two. Okay, I'm going to do that for a few different areas. So first, let's talk about that shadow. Okay, so you're in the right color family. We are in a red color family, so that's good. And we have that cool light, warm shadow relationship. But you can see that the red on average is a little bit too hot and a little bit too light in value. So if you squint your eyes, you can kind of see that it should be a little darker. And this would be a really easy color to fix. So to get from here to here, all you need to do is add ultramarine blue. And maybe yellow ochre. I'm going to put a question mark by that. So that would be if you, let's say you added the ultramarine blue, but then it still feels too hot of a color, or maybe it went too dark. Instead of adding more red back in, add a touch of yellow ochre. So the concept behind this, if we think back to our color theory lecture, is that we're adding blue and yellow, which makes a green, and this is a red, and so those are complementary colors. And so by adding the green into the red, we're canceling out some of the red and making it more neutral. Okay, so I know that could be rudimentary kind of information for some of you, but just remember that's how I think about my colors logically when I'm trying to correct a color that I might not have gotten correct in my first pass of a color of a painting. So that's something to think about. All right, let's go back to taking a sample. So the next area, I'm going to try to find her average flesh tone. Okay, so I'm going to take it from about here, or maybe from about here. Let me see, it's a little bit lighter. I would say this is closer to her average flesh tone right here. So I'm going to do a sample of that. Oops, that is what the model is, so I'm going to put that here on the left, on the right, and then I'm going to take an average of the same area, And I'm thinking that your color might have gotten too washed out too quickly. So we're going to, but let's go ahead and move through and grab a couple of other areas. The only other area I would say maybe the color needs some adjusting is this area down in here. So if I take kind of like an average of that transition tone going into the shadow, and then I grab what you have here, you can see that yours is a little bit more red. So let's talk about how you can adjust those. So here is that average flesh. This is the shadow. So to get from there to what her average flesh tone is, which is a little bit darker. She's very pale, but it's a little bit darker than that. So I think you would just need to just add a little bit more, maybe yellow ochre and alizarin. And you would end up with a color like this. Probably more alizarin than yellow ochre. But that's going to give you that nice fleshy pink that is her dominant flesh tone. Rosalie, no, I'm not using Photoshop. This program is called Procreate. It's an app for iPad. Okay, and so let's see. And then the other area here, that transition out of the shadows. So the reason this jumps kind of harsh is partly because you need more of that average flesh tone there, but also this color is a little bit on the warm side. And you can kind of see it starts off kind of more of a neutral, but then it gets very green gray right through here. So to get from that color, this rosy color, to this color, what you would, you're pretty close to the right value family. You're maybe a little dark. You would want to add a little ultramarine blue, because remember that's going to kind of cool it off, and maybe a touch of yellow ochre. Again, it's like adding that green. And if that ends up too saturated, then maybe also a touch of white. So that's a question mark, because that's just if this makes it too dark. Okay, and so this was the shadow transition in the cheek. I'm just taking these notes because I'm going to send you guys pictures of these color samples for your own reference. So that's that color there. So one thing that really I noticed in a lot of other students from this morning was that having such a hot color in the shadow really threw off our sense of warm and cool in these transition zones, because of course by comparison this color here is going to feel really hot compared to this. But if it's cooled down appropriately to what the color is, then this color is going to feel warmer by comparison. So it's about that kind of general relationship that we're trying to establish between colors in our painting. Another area, I think you have actually some really nice color transitions in here. That feels pretty spot on when I take those samples. Here, I'll do one here just so you can kind of see. I feel like you got pretty close. Maybe it's a little on the light side. It kind of depends on where I take that from. So you might be a little bit on the pale side with that value, but that's probably because these light values are so pale. So of course that would kind of darken it a little bit more. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to do a quick paint over. Okay, and show you what your painting would look like with some of these adjustments. So we're going to start with the shadow adjustment because that's going to be the main one that really influences how we perceive the rest of the flesh tones. And even her lighter tone under here, do a quick, remember it reflects that shadow color, very similar. And even her lights have maybe a little more ochre, they're not quite as hot of a color. She has red kind of copper transitions, but you can kind of see how just changing some of those colors helps to influence the flesh tone, especially when it comes to saturation. So remember, saturation or chroma is the intensity of a color. So when we're trying to judge flesh tones against something that is so hot and warm, any kind of intense red next to the subtlety of her flesh tone is going to make her, and it starts to feel too intense, then you can always tone it back. Even if your initial attempt at mixing the color, when you were doing your color mixtures, like pre-mixing, were off, you can make corrections. And I do that too. So actually, even in some of the demos, I talk about that. I mixed a shadow value and I thought this is the right color one day, and then the next day I came in, and when I started to lay it down and feel out some of the relationships, I realized it had been too red. And so I made some adjustments to the color. And that's okay to do. Absolutely. Okay, so let's go down here now and start to paint in some of those halftones down in the jawline. So you can see it's a cooler halftone, especially back in here. She has more of that shadow in here. And then we transition to a pink that I think maybe if you just went in with that average flesh tone or made your average flesh tone a little darker, and even still, this is the cheek area, so you might even have a slightly more chromatic pink right through the apple of the cheek here. But even this average flesh tone, you can see she has a bit more color through the forehead. And I know earlier someone had a question about the color zones of the forehead from our lecture, and I'll bring that up here in just a second. So yeah, just adding more, looking for areas where you can enhance some of those reds or the average flesh tone in different areas of the portrait really can add up and make a difference. So let's take a look at kind of a before and after. So just adding a little more chroma to a few of those areas, and you can see how that makes it a little bit more distinct. And you might find yourself needing to go in then and even add a little bit more rosiness to the lips as well, or even to the tip of the nose. You might find as you adjusted other colors, you could actually add chroma to some other areas that are even more intense. Okay, so let me talk about the color zones of the forehead. So something one of my morning students brought up was, she said she had a hard time seeing the yellow zone of the forehead, and she asked, is it always that? Is it always yellow? Because I can't see it. And the answer is no. So usually the yellow zone is prominent in someone who maybe has, well, we can't quite see her full forehead, but the reason it's kind of yellow, or what we consider yellow, is because that's where the bone comes to the surface the most in the face. Everywhere else is kind of more fleshy. You have more muscle and fat and thicker skin, you know, down in the lower part of the face that influences the color. One of the areas that you do sometimes get a little bit more of a pink as opposed to a yellow in the forehead is right through the brow muscle, because it's a thicker kind of muscular area. You will see more yellow typically through what we can't see on her which is through the bony part of the forehead. However, it's not always yellow. It's usually either yellowish or more neutral. So just keep that in mind. It's some flexibility. The color zones of the face are not always obvious on every single person, but it's important to be aware of them so that you can take note of some of these very subtle color shifts that we get as we move from dark to light and as we move from, the top of the head to the bottom of the head. And also keeping in mind the fall off of light, which refers to where the lighting is most intense, because our light is coming from up here. So it's going to hit the most intense through these zones. So you can kind of see this triangular intense area of light. And then as it wraps away and down and away and down, it becomes darker and less intense. Okay, so that's that fall off of light. All right, so if you have any follow-up questions for me, just send me an email since you're not in here right now. Other than that, everything looks really, really good. I think it's really just about getting that shadow color a little bit more neutral and adding in some of those more saturated colors on the in between. It's really easy on someone really fair to wash them out too quickly. And if you're using a titanium white instead of like a lead-based white, then it happens even faster because titanium white is so cool of a color, and you have to make sure you're not washing out your values too quickly. All right, really nice work though, and I look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right. Sapana, I'm so sorry. I want you to email me the correct pronunciation for your name so I can say it correctly. So I'm going to shrink down this picture here. But before we get started, can you please tell me if the color in your painting feels pretty accurate to how it feels in real life? Because right now the photo feels a little bit on the yellow side, and so I want to make sure I can color correct that before we talk about your color mixtures. Because I want to give you guys the best, most accurate critiques as possible. Because I can make some color adjustments in here. Also, let me know if the painting feels too bright. If you feel like your camera overexposed, I can adjust some of the curves in the value scale here. So I'm going to actually just start by adjusting. I'm waiting for you to respond, but there is going to be a little delay between me talking and you responding, and that's fine. But I get the feeling like it's a little on the yellow side, so I'm going to start to take that out, and you just let me know if it looks better or needs let me see, undo. Okay, so it's still yellower. Yeah, and that can be due to the camera, but the white light helps, but it can still sometimes come across as yellow, and if that's the case, sometimes adjusting it in your camera or in your phone as you're taking the picture, or even post-editing, it can help. So I'll take out some of that yellow and maybe take out some of that red. How does that feel? Is that a little closer? And you're using an iPhone, yeah. And they don't have an adjustment for temperature there. I always find that the iPhone tends to over-exaggerate some of the yellow and the red anyway. So whenever I'm done taking pictures with my iPhone, I have to go in and do a little bit of post-editing. And I think I'm going to bring down the curves just a little bit. But you tell me if that looks better or worse. I'm just bringing the values down just a touch. And sometimes when you edit that, the saturation gets a little intense. So I like to tweak these things just before we get started. Does that look okay to you? Natalie, yes, I do. And I did upload a video. Was it last week or the week before on how to, or no, I'd sent it out in an email. So if you check the email from me for the group critique instructions, you will see that there is a link to a YouTube video that I kind of have private. And it talks about how to use a couple of apps on your phone to help you take a good picture. And I talk a little bit about getting the light. So yeah, take a look, find that email. And if you don't have it, just email me and I'll send you a link again. It's not on my public, it's not listed public on my YouTube channel, so you won't be able to find it there. So I'll have to send you like a link to view it. Okay, so yeah, there's a few apps that actually you can download on your iPhone or your Android phone that give you a little bit more control over the exposure and the color temperature when you're taking a picture, better than like the built-in app like camera. So I recommend doing something like that because it can make a difference and make it easier on you. All right, Rosalie, I will post it in the forum, the community forum for the class. So you'll see that there too. Because I had only sent it out in the email to those who were participating in the live critique. So I'll send that out so everyone has it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. I think it's mostly that we want to maybe go a little warmer with some of these darker shadows. I do feel like your shadow here is pretty close. So let me just do a little color sample. Let's make a few small comparisons. So I'm going to just compare like this average shadow here, maybe the same average shadow there. You might be a little bit on the light side. Now that could be due to the painting drying and sinking in a little bit. Yes, Jody, no problem. I'm going to post it in the forum so everyone will get an email notification with the link. I'll try and do that today after class. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about these darker values. So in the shadow there, that's the value, and then what we have here is kind of a gray. So I can't tell if that's just because the painting has dried and sunk in, but it looks a little bit more like it has to do with the color temperature. So we'll talk about how you can adjust those. I'm going to just go ahead and take a few other color samples though. So let's talk about the transition maybe here in the cheek. So the ones on the left are the ones on the right are the actual photo, and then the ones on the left are the ones from your painting. So let's take this as the transition color here. All right, let's start with those, and then we'll move over into the lights. So for this color, I'm going to shrink this down so I have a little more room for these notes. All right. So your difference here for the main shadow, so this is main shadow, is they're really close. So I think to get from there to there, all you're really going to need to do is maybe add a little bit of ultramarine blue. You're in the right color family, so I feel like just going a little bit darker with it would probably help. Now that could be that this painting is sunk in, so if you oiled this out and it feels like it's more like this color, then you don't really need to do anything. Sinking in usually makes the colors feel lighter than they felt when you were painting them wet. So you can always oil out this area first and then compare. So moving down into the darker shadow, so you have something that's a little bit more on the green side. So to move from here to here, you could either just start with a fresh color, or you could probably add, let's see, I would probably add maybe burnt sienna. And that might be enough, but if it's not, you might need to throw in maybe some ultramarine blue, or even maybe some alizarin. Oddly enough, you'd think alizarin would not work, but it could also deepen that red. But it might make it too chromatic, so I would maybe try the ultramarine blue first and see how that works. So this is the dark shadow. So that's this darker shadow within the features. And then here is our transition. Area from the shadow to the cheek. And we go from an orange to something that's a more muted violet. So you could use this color to get here, but you're probably going to want to use maybe some alizarin, and that might do it just alone because it's kind of a complementary color to that orange. You're in the right value family, so that's good. And if that doesn't work, you might try throwing in a little bit of ultramarine blue. But I'll put a question mark by that one because that might be just optional. So let's go ahead and take a look now at some of the light values. The reflection value, no. Okay, so the reflection under the chin has white. That's what you were just asking. I'm just repeating that for those who can't see the chat. So no, generally speaking, you do not want to add white into your shadows. The reason for that is the white tends to cool off the color, and it also adds a level of opacity that can cause your colors to kind of compete with the light mass. And so you're okay in the sense that this is still dark enough, but it's kind of a risk. And in general, if I can get away with not using white, I do. There are a few situations in painting, in like a photo reference, like if you have someone who has a really bright white shirt on and the sun is hitting and is bouncing a ton of light into the under jaw, then sometimes you can utilize a little bit of white. Another exception to that rule was if you had a model who was in a room that had all white walls and the white was reflecting everywhere into the shadow, then sometimes you will want that opacity. But generally, we want that depth and transparency to the shadow. So instead of using white to lighten this area, I would use like a yellow ochre, or even maybe like a lead tin yellow or a Naples yellow, just not white. And that's mostly because white has that tendency to cool things off, and it can kind of destroy the illusion of the form between light and shadow. Does that make sense? It's not like no rules in painting are absolute. There's always exceptions to the rules, but we learn the rules in order to know how to break them and when they're appropriate to follow, if that makes sense. So that could be why this color ended up too gray, is because you had the addition of white mixed in. So to avoid that, you don't put white in your shadows, only in your halftones to your light mass. Yeah, shadow colors are a very common color to struggle with. It's so funny because we would think that they'd be simple compared to other areas of the face, but really if you try to eliminate white whenever possible and just utilize like a yellow, or even if I wanted to get a really intense bright under reflected light, then I would maybe use yellow ochre and cad red instead, and which are both opaque colors, but they're a little bit more chromatic, and so we're going to have a little bit that richer color, if that makes sense. And you have to remember the environment influences. So if you think back to when we had the Asaro head, and I showed how all the colors reflect into the shadows of the environment. So let's say this model was wearing a bright red or green shirt, and the collar came up to, you know, like up here. Let's say she was wearing a bright red shirt and it came up to here. You would see a very intense red kind of pick up here. Not that intense, but you would see it start to pick up in that shadow. You'll notice on this week's model, Jasmine, for the new lesson, she's wearing a black shirt and the collar comes up quite high. And one of the students pointed out earlier like that she doesn't have as much variety within her shadows, not as much light coming back into her shadows. And part of that is because she's wearing a black shirt, so it doesn't reflect any light into that shadow on her jaw. But also she has dark hair. And so with this model, we had all this dark, or this hair color influencing that shadow. And with the medium flesh tone model, she has dark hair, so it's not really reflecting much light into that shadow. So it's going to feel darker and a little bit different. So I just wanted to point that out because in that case, you're definitely not going to want to add white to the model's shadows. Okay, so let's go in and take a couple of samples of the light mass. So I'm going to go for her average flesh tone now, which is about here. It's kind of a soft rosy blush color. And then I'll take something very similar. So I think it's a similar thing. Now, if you feel like this painting or the photo of your painting is still too yellow, that could account for this slight difference. So just pay attention to that when you're comparing the two. But you can see kind of going from here, this is much more of a peach tone, and this is more of a kind of softer lavender color. It has a little bit more of a blushy pink to it. So it'd be very easy to get from this color to this color. You're just going to add probably something like a cool red, like alizarin, and maybe a touch of ultramarine blue, but that would be really dependent on the type of alizarin or alizarin substitute that you use. If you're using like something like a quinacridone rose, it goes very hot pink, and in that case you would definitely want to use the ultramarine blue. So it depends on what you're using for your cool red, but that's going to give you more of this color. Okay, so the only other area I see a very distinct difference in the color is this gray color that she gets down in here. It's kind of a green. Now compared to her cheeks, it looks green. So if we take the cheek color here, that nice saturated pink, right? We get that real saturated kind of rosy pink that we have here in her cheeks. It's about the same. So you can see that color shift almost immediately. It goes, and so even though we might not see this color here and think, oh, that's a green, compared to the pink, it is shifting towards yellow and blue. So that's why I say it's kind of a green. In reality, it's very neutral. But so I think what's happening maybe down here could use, rather than going maybe more towards this color that you have, and I'll take a sample here. You can see yours has quite a bit more red in it still. So this color and this color, how those relate. So to get from, so I think your cheek color, you have plenty of pink in the cheeks, so I'm not too worried about that. But what I'm thinking is that to get from there to there and there to there, you just, actually, sorry, reverse that. You want to go this direction. You have a lot of yellow in there, so you're going to want to add probably a little bit of ultramarine blue. You might have enough yellow in here to where once you add the ultramarine blue, it's enough. And this one you might want to add plus white. Maybe for this one too, if the ultramarine blue makes it too dark. So what I'm going to do now is a quick little paint over. And we're going to start with kind of deepening that shadow just a little bit, especially where you had added some of that white. And then we're going to go a little bit warmer in this area. I just do this so that you can see, in case you don't have time to go in and work on your painting, which is fine, just so you can see kind of how these colors are working together. Okay, and then the transition in the cheek, a little more of a rosy color, and it actually kind of goes a little more green actually as it comes back into here and into the forehead. It's more similar to the color we get around the muzzle here. So it's almost like you have a little pink zone right through this middle, where this is more of the transition color. She does have a little deeper kind of hollow in her cheek too, so you can use a little bit of this color for that. Just make sure it doesn't go too dark. And then her average flesh tone, it could cool off just a little bit, and maybe you could use a little more of it so that it doesn't get so washed out. I can't tell if that's just the photo though. And then most importantly is these transitions down below, right through here, through the muzzle and the lower jaw, where it really turns into that gray zone. We don't want her to look like she has a 4 o'clock shadow, or 5 o'clock shadow, that's what they call it, a mustache or anything like that. But we do get that cooling kind of zone down in here. One thing that will help prevent that is by making sure you have a little bit of that blushy color, and maybe a little bit more of a pickup of maybe the pink that you use in the cheek. Use a little bit of that in the chin, because the ball of the chin does tend to get a little bit more pink in it, just very subtly. You'll also notice in her eye socket that she has a little bit more of a gray, and that's because this plane is turning under, so it doesn't actually get that much light, not compared to the area like up in the forehead or other areas around. I think the nose has plenty of color in there, although I would say don't be afraid to warm up that shadow. And when you go in with your darker cast shadow, make sure it's very warm by comparison. And no white in that color, of course. So let's just take a look there at that slight difference. Of course, this looks more airbrushed, and that's not the point. It's okay for your painting to look more brushy and more blocked in. But I just wanted to show you how those color shifts could be enhanced, and then it adds kind of more dynamic qualities to the painting. And these things can be really difficult to detect on fair skin because their values, her values in the lights, these shifts are very, very subtle. There isn't like a giant jump between, like this value and this one, because she's so fair, right? So this is very gradual as this turns. So it's easy for them to get kind of washed out. You'll notice with like the medium skin tone and especially our dark skin tone model, the jump between the highlight color and the average flesh tone is going to become wider and wider, meaning further apart. So they're not going to be so close to one another in terms of value. All right. Do you have any questions? You did a really nice job with the general relationships between the light and shadow, though. Like your values were pretty spot on and everything. So good job. All right, perfect. Well, thank you, and I look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Brenda, you are up, and I wanted you to tell me, because this picture feels a little hot in terms of the shadow color, so I want you to let me know if it needs to be kind of toned back a little bit. Also, if it's too bright. So I can make some adjustments before we jump in. I'm going to go ahead and just crop this down so we just focus on the portrait. If you guys are feeling really pressed for time when you're painting too, just keep in mind that you can just focus on the head. If you don't have time to paint everything else, don't worry about it. A couple of people had turned in some where they weren't able to quite get down into the chest and the shirt and that sort of thing. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, so it is that bright, but it's a little bit blue. Okay, so let me adjust some of that color balance. So maybe a little bit more, oops. I was doing that to the photo reference, not your painting. So maybe a little bit more like that. What about the shadow? The hair and the shadow, does it feel that red to you? That red-orange, or is it a little less saturated? Or a little more blue or a different direction? Because I can take that, maybe take out some of the red. And a touch darker. Oh, okay. Alrighty. So let me just bring that down a little bit. How does that feel? It is less saturated. Okay, I had a feeling that that's the case, so I'm going to just take that down just a notch. And sometimes when you adjust the curves on these on a picture, the light and darkness, it can really oversaturate one area. And I do have noticed that certain types of cameras have too much, still too red. Okay, let me see what I can do about that. I don't know why it's not wanting to take. Maybe a little balance of these two will help. Is that a little bit better? All right, well, okay, so there's something I also brought up with the morning session. Some of you might be working from prints, and some of you might be working from a monitor. There can be a lot of variation between what I'm seeing in your picture because of the camera that took the picture of your painting and also between the monitor you're using and the one I'm using for analyzing the colors. Or if you're using a printer, there's a huge variation between printers. Some have a tendency to print cool or warm. So when I'm giving you these corrections, these are just areas I want you to take a look at and kind of analyze for yourself. You might find that some of those things are true, and you might find that some of them actually are maybe coming across in the picture as too red or something. And in real life, your painting doesn't quite have that. So if I say correct the shadow, you know, or you might reassess the shadow, but then you're looking at your painting in real life and it's not quite feeling that way. It probably has to do with the difference between your monitor, mine, or your photo reference that you used when you were mixing your color. So just keep that in mind. There has to be a little bit of flexibility just due to the technology. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing I will suggest is probably that shadow, but I'm going to just keep in mind that you're saying it's a little too red. And so we'll kind of just keep that in mind when you're looking at your colors. So I would say mostly this reflected light color. So let's do a little sample of yours. Let's do a sample of this one here. And maybe even the average shadow, or the darker shadow, could be a little bit less red. And like I said, just remember that it could be a slight tweaking between the monitors. Okay, let me take a look at, grab a sample of this halftone. And the halftone here. So those are really close together. So let's just start with those. And I'll reiterate, you don't have to make adjustments to these. I don't expect you guys to even have time to do that because you have a whole other painting to do. This is just to help you kind of make corrections if you were struggling with an area, or think about, you know, what you might do differently if you tried to do another painting similar from the same reference or one of the similar shots that I provided. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so this is our shadow / reflected light. And you can see it's very orange. So a simple solution for that would be to add ultramarine blue. That should give you, there seems to be enough yellow in this color that it would kind of end up somewhere around here if you just added blue. If not, you might add a little bit of yellow ochre if it kind of still went too, or if it got too dark, for example, then you might add a little ochre to lighten it up instead, and that would help to get it a little closer to that color. For this one, I think the same, very similar thing. You wouldn't actually add ultramarine blue, but I think just a touch of yellow ochre. You're really close to the right value, so it might even just be a small amount of yellow ochre that would do the trick. But if it got too light, then maybe add a little bit of blue in there to bring it back to the right value, and that would help to further neutralize that color. Essentially, again, we're adding green to that red to help kind of cancel it out. And then this halftone color, I feel like it's pretty good for this cheek area, but when we get down in here, it should pick up a little bit more cool. And I think adding ultramarine blue, oops, and maybe a little bit of white so it doesn't get too dark, because your values actually are really good. It's just that the color got a little bit off. That would get you to that color there. Your light colors actually feel really spot on. The gray in here looks really good. Maybe you could go a little bit more, adding just a little more gray over on this side. I'll do that in the paint over. The cheek color looks good. Maybe her forehead got a little bit washed out. Maybe this color could cool off a little bit. Let's try that as a sample here. So that's her cheek color right where it transitions to that shadow. And then yours is a little bit on the orange side. So maybe throwing in to that one, I would suggest, so this is cheek. Shadow transition. To get there to there, you have essentially like an orange here. So you would just add, I would say, alizarin and ultramarine blue. And the alizarin, I would start with the alizarin because it depends on the brand that you're using, and then add the ultramarine blue kind of as needed. That should get it to the right value too. It'll bring it a little bit darker and you'll get more wrap out of that form where maybe it feels a little bit hard. Coming out and taking a look around. Yeah, back in here, and I think down in here, we have a very similar color. Let me switch brushes here. I'm pretty sure you're in the right kind of color family. You're really close. You might be a little bit more red, but you're really, really close. And that could just be an error of the camera picking that up. So because you said it's looking a little red. So I'm going to kind of scrap that. And let's go ahead and do your paint over. If you have any questions, Brenda, just go ahead and type it in. All right, so let's look at that shadow as a starting point. So that reflected light, if we tone that down first, you can see this almost looks green by comparison. And we went in, went maybe just a touch lighter with that core shadow and that darker shadow. Transition, just take some of that red out. And I would say probably do the same in the hair. I'll just do that real quick just so that we can see the distinction there. And then let's move down into that transition. In the lower part, down in here. So you can see how just cooling that off a little bit. You almost actually have that color over here, it seems. So maybe just utilizing a little bit more of it. And then it starts to get a little bit more rosy, ever so slightly, right through there. And then it does pick up that kind of pink tone, almost like what you have over here. But maybe we could go in with a little bit more, kind of maybe a cooler pink. Not that cool though. I think that pictures something closer to what you have for your average flesh tone. Yeah, that seems a little closer. So, and then you're going to incorporate some of that as well, a little bit in the forehead and through the keystone shape. So that way that highlight in the forehead has a little bit more impact. And then she has that cool greenish gray that you see a lot down in here and that you have through the lower transition in the face. She has a bit more of that back in here. So it's almost like it goes from being more of like a pink, like a blushy pink, right through the cheek of that as that transition, then it goes more green towards the top and greener towards the bottom here, if that makes sense. Now she's looking a little bit like she has a beard, so we need to work on that now that I've edited some of those colors. So some of that has to do with how quickly some of those transitions happen. So if you go lighter, make sure it doesn't look too dark, especially like over here where it transitions. And then introducing that slight pink back into the chin area. And don't be afraid to push this a little bit more, almost as a little shadow under that lip. And then her eye sockets, it's very similar. It's kind of this gray. It doesn't quite get enough light there, so it's kind of like the color that we see here in the temple. It's a little lighter on this side, I believe, but it's still kind of a cool color compared to those other pink areas in the face. And you could always bump the pink a little bit in the nose. I always like to, just in the tip of the nose, to add, again, that a little bit more color to that red zone of the face. She actually does also get a very cool gray right here and here in that keystone shape. And you actually have a lot of that color down in here. So, and I can see where you incorporated it. So it could just not be coming through in the painting here. But I think the biggest thing is looking at how that shadow makes a huge difference with your perception of the skin tones. Because when you have a really oversaturated shadow, it can make the subtleties in those red zones of the face kind of bleach out. The same thing happens if you're painting a model, especially like someone who has more of like a pink undertone. So this week, you guys are going to get a bonus lecture on undertones. And someone who has like a pinker undertone to their skin will have, it will look very gray and kind of green under if you had like a bright cadmium red background for your model. So just think about like color relationships in that way too. So just by having that really intense orange-red shadow, it really kind of made her flesh tones feel a little bit more washed out, which is probably why you went in and saturated a few of them more like with more of an orangey tint. But you can see when it's adjusted, then suddenly the other colors lock right in. Does that make sense? And it gives us a more naturalistic kind of feeling too to the flesh tones. Flesh tones are largely neutral colors with slight shifts towards red, slight shifts towards green or gray or violet or pink. But if you look here, there's nothing as saturated as like a cad red. Nothing as chromatic as a cadmium red or even a really hot pink. you know, or even if we took like a primary blue, you know, if you look at all of these colors here and compare them to those, you can see how all of these are very neutral and kind of gray versions of those colors. Yeah, and that happens too. You know, if you're rushing through and that's okay. This is part of kind of the class. And I realize this class is a little bit more fast paced. Um, again, don't worry about having a finished looking painting. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece. You could leave it tiled if you want, because then I can just pick one color and show you, you know, that particular tile could be shifted this way or that. It doesn't have to look like a finished painting. So if you're feeling rushed, excuse me, if you're feeling rushed for time, you can leave it tiled. So don't worry about that. It's not, just kind of like I said, it's not a drawing class. So I didn't spend hours showing you how to do the drawing. I did a kind of speed demo. Same idea. I'm not here to correct drawing errors in this particular focused class because we are just focusing on color mixing and like some of the nuances in flesh tones. And so that should be the kind of focus in your own mind as you're approaching your paintings. And I should have just said this last week. I just kind of forgot, and I just wanted everyone. I wanted to really emphasize that this time, to not stress about having a what looks like a finished painting. Even if mine looks a little more finished for the demo, I don't expect that of you guys. I know it's a lot of work, and my demos I tried to push through as fast as I could. And to me, by my own standards for my work, they're not finished. But you know, I want to give you guys the best demonstration I can without compromising, you know, the quality. But I don't expect you guys to have something that looks like a finished painting that you spent weeks on. I have other classes for that in particular where we spend 10 weeks on one painting, and there's plenty of time to go in depth. Okay, sorry, I forgot to look at the name. Natalie. Okay. So Natalie, you are up. And before we get started with yours, please let me know if it feels too saturated or too warm. My feeling is that it looks a little bit on the yellow side. And maybe a little bit bright. I can't quite tell. Oops. I keep selecting the wrong layers. All right. Yeah, it's a little bit yellow. How about the values? Does it feel pretty accurate in terms of brightness? I'll adjust the color balance first. So I'm going to take out some of that yellow. Maybe take down some of the red a little bit. I know it's subtle, a subtle difference, but how does that look to you? Your background's a little more purple. I can try pushing that over, but it's going to make the skin tones jump out a little bit more. Let's not worry about the background too much. Just let me know if the skin tones feel a little bit more appropriate to you. Because that's what we'll be focusing on. Let's see, I'll try adjusting the curves or the brightness maybe just a little bit. How does that look? Again, you're not comparing it to this photo, even though that's what we will be comparing it to for the demo, but more how your painting feels in person. So I would like to get that as close as possible first. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, you captured a really nice likeness of the model. Let's start with that shadow color, because we can already kind of see, just looking at them side by side, that it's maybe a little orange. And she does have that orange quality in that shadow, but it's just a little bit more of a muted orange, and maybe a little touch darker. So I'm going to take that same area here, and we're just going to compare these two. And that's a really easy fix to get from there to the other color. And then I think this down here, you're pretty close to the right value. Especially back in here, I feel like that is almost that color. But down in here, maybe you would just incorporate that color instead. And it could be that you were trying to get kind of this greenish transition that we see in here. Actually, that's much, that's much closer in terms of hue. All right, and then let me look at that transition tone area here. And then we'll make a quick comparison here. Okay, so let's start to, and don't be alarmed if there is like a big jump, because it can also be sometimes the photo reference if you use a different monitor. I know my monitor in my studio has a tendency to look a little bit more yellow than, say, like an because it's an slightly older monitor. But then if I look at something on like my Mac or my iMac, it has more of a blue cast. So there can be, you know, slight differences even there, which makes editing pictures a little bit tricky. Okay, so let's start with that shadow color. All right, so to get from here to here, you're going to want to just add probably ultramarine blue. That might be enough. If it goes too green on you, you can also add a little bit of burnt sienna, and that would get you right to that color. It'll darken it, and it'll also make it a little bit more kind of grayed out using that blue, because this has so much yellow in it. To go from here to here, you're almost in the identical color family. So remember, this is from, so this is reflected light. And I'll just say jaw, so you know where I pulled the reference from. And then this is neck shadow. So this would be a really easy fix. I think all you'd have to do is add a little burnt sienna. And if that goes too red, then you might adjust it with a little ultramarine blue. So it's kind of the reverse of this. Start with the ultramarine blue and then use the burnt sienna. Here I would start with the burnt sienna and see where that gets you. And that should do it, but if not, I'll do a question mark ultramarine blue. So you can kind of play with that and see how it feels. These colors, they seem very different, but it doesn't mean you can't get from here to here. This is kind of an orange, so to add the complementary color of an orange is like a violet or a red violet. So I would say the addition of alizarin to start, and then maybe a little bit of ultramarine blue. And that should help to adjust some of those colors. And I think if you get those colors to balance, the flesh tones are going to feel a little more balanced as well. The only other area where I don't quite feel enough of that kind of grayish green is in that side plane of the face. So I'm going to do a sample of that. Sorry, that's the color we want. And then if I take the color from a similar area, well, it's like you have it almost here. You're going to go, you could either start with a fresh pile of paint if you were going to adjust these, or you could take this color and add, so we're kind of going from a pinkish tone to more of a blue pink. It's almost a blue-gray violet. So I would say start off with adding ultramarine blue, of course, and then you might have to add a little bit of white to keep the value in check. And if that doesn't quite do it, well, actually that should do it because you have plenty of red in here. So yeah, I think that would be pretty good. And I feel like I see some of that color around here too. So you might even have it on your palette, but maybe it just got blended in and influenced by this average flesh tone. And actually, let's take a look at that average flesh tone in the forehead. It might be a little bit on the pink side. And she has a little bit, and it's maybe a little on the dark side. Judge that as you can. Just because, you know, meaning if your painting feels a little different than this picture does in the edit, then in the photograph, then don't worry about it. Just take a look at some of these color samples and look at your painting in person and make your own judgment on that. Because I still feel like maybe this painting is leaning towards pink a little bit too much and not showing off some of those cool colors that you probably have in there. So here you have your average flesh tone. This was the half-tone jaw on the left. So average flesh tone, I think just going maybe a little bit lighter, so you would add a little bit of white, maybe a touch of ultramarine blue if it's still too pink. I'm going to just space that out a little bit more. No, I wouldn't necessarily say that. It's better to try and see it because whenever we're painting from life, so to answer your question, do you think it'd be helpful to use Procreate to color pick? It's only useful if you're trying to see what's going wrong in your painting, because really, ultimately, what the program is seeing is a single color from like a tiny pixel, right? And there's just, you can even see just as I move across a very tight area, there's all this shift. I think that'd be too overwhelming. And besides, you're wanting to learn to paint as kind of naturalist as you can. And so while it's a great tool for kind of helping you guys edit, I don't use this when I paint. So I try to just observe. And if you can paint from life, it's even better. Because there is no using a color picker, and the camera has a tendency to flatten color and lose some nuance that you might see in person when a person's sitting there in front of you. So just to form good habits as a painter, I would suggest that you just learn to observe, even if you're working from photos. Don't become too reliant on the working from photo thing, because it can result in flatter work, and it doesn't mean working from photos is bad by any means. I work from photographs now, but when I was studying, I spent as much time as I could studying from life. because you just see things differently. Does that make sense? And then you don't become too reliant on certain tools like this, or some people tend to, they can really comfortably draw from a photograph because it's already flattened for them. But drawing from life is much harder, right? So if you train yourself drawing kind of from the harder method, it's much easier to transition to working from something like a photo. Now, because this is an online class, I'm providing photo reference, etc. It's fine to work from photos. I'm not one of those artists that has like a, I don't sneer down at working from photos, because just to be practical as an artist, you can't always hire a model to sit for you for hours. And for me, my paintings take me like, I don't know, 40 to 60 hours to finish, sometimes more. And I don't have people available to me all the time for that. So just, I tend to keep a more open mind about working from photo reference, because I realize a lot of us are in the same shoes and we paint when we can. And that just requires some flexibility in terms of working from photographs. But it helps as a painter to also realize the limitations of photos. So even if you're not painting portraits from life, try painting still life, or something you can set up in your studio from life. Buy an Asaro head and put a color, light on it, and try observing those colors, like I provided in the pictures, but do it from life, because the colors are really just even more kind of palpable when you're looking at it in person. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick paint over, and then we'll kind of open up for questions. So the first thing I'm going to do is tone down that shadow. So let me start there. So I'm going to tone down that reflected light. And then go in a little darker with your transition shadow. So already, right off the bat, you can see how that influenced the feeling in the cheeks and the color, the like kind of more pink colors in the skin. It's not competing with it as much. The hair still competes, but let's go ahead and go over that. I'll just pick an average color. So if you bring that shadow color of the hair into more of like a neutral zone, I know she has like some areas that are a little more red. But if you can already see how that's starting to balance out some of the pink, and it's not washing out those lights. This is that lower transition through the jawline and cheek. She kind of has that purple, and you notice how it almost reflects that background color. That's a lot of the times why we're seeing that, and some of it has to do with the color zones of the face. But you see more of that color zone effect in here. But this is starting to wrap back towards that shadow, and so it's picking up some of the environment. Same thing on this far side. It kind of goes from being more of a purple hue to something that's more of a green. And so you can see that difference between color zones of the face and the environment. Those influential factors that we think about. And you'll see again in this new weekend's lecture, we're going to talk about undertones. So there's another factor to think about. And I don't want everyone to get overwhelmed by all of the different things we have to think about. But it's just more like if you're having trouble matching a color, these are things you can go to and think of, think very consciously about if you're having trouble, figuring out what a color is, you can go, well, what about the color zone? What color zone does it belong to? Or what are some of the environmental factors that might be influencing some of the flesh tones? So these are the types of questions we want to ask ourselves. Okay, so this is going down into the halftone of the jaw, and it gets a little bit lighter and cooler, especially on this side. And we get a little bit of that influence in this section up here too. And then the average flesh tone, I think if we just cooled it off a touch, you can still leave some of those real intense pinks, especially down in the cheek area. But if you just kind of toned it back a tiny bit, you can start to see how that influences that relationship between the colors starts to work together. So let's just make a quick comparison. And what it does is it kind of balances out that beautiful pink that you had in the cheeks, but now it's not kind of dominating everywhere. It's kind of concentrated in that red zone of the face. So let's take a look at how just cooling off a few of those areas. She might have gotten a little too cool in that bottom half. Maybe balance that out a little bit. But just looking at that transition, we can definitely detect some of that cool zone. And sometimes it's a matter of maybe even taking some of that average flesh tone that you have and combining it with just a little bit of that gray. Just enough to slightly shift it, but it's not going to be, really, really intense and obvious. So just showing you that slight cooled off as well. All right, really nice job though. Do you have any questions? So I will be sending out this picture with the paint over and the color notes for everyone to kind of have. So keep an eye out for an email from me. And oh, you're very, very welcome. So does anyone have questions about next weekend? So remember, we are meeting on Sunday, not Saturday. Same time. So we'll still meet at 2:30. But you can send me your homework on Saturday, so you have an extra day to get through that. And also this week's demonstration, the actual painting demo, is I think about 2 hours, 2.5. It's not, I think the other one was like 3.5. It was quite long. So this one should be a little bit less intense in terms of length of having to, how much you have to watch. And there's new photo references and also a download of my demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to everyone, anyone who's not in the group, for critiques. If you have questions about the class, feel free to type it in, and if not, then we will end our session. Oh, thank you too, Brenda. Have a fantastic weekend as well. And remember, you guys can always, if you do think of a question or you make some edits to your painting, if you have time, then you're more than welcome to email me another picture if you want some further feedback by email. And I will try to remember, let me write down a note for myself, to post a link to that video on how to take better photos. I'm writing a note for myself right now so I don't forget to do that. And I will also post a link of this recording in the forum so that you can come back and rewatch this if you're wanting to revisit your painting at any time in the future. So you don't have to do it now. If you can do that later after the class has ended, these videos will remain available on my YouTube channel. All right, it doesn't look like there's any questions. All right, guys, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a great week and enjoy the new lessons. And I'll see you next Sunday.